I think Americans can come away from these experiences understanding that the elections really are a theater exercise to convince us that we still have some voice in the running of this country, but we don't.
While some online bullion dealers continue to charge almost $4 over spot for U.S. Mint Silver Eagles, SD Bullion is selling 2017 Silver Eagles for just $2.29 over spot on any quantity. Again, that's just $2.29 over spot for any quantity. If you haven't joined the over 40,000 precious metals investors by making the switch to SD Bullion, what are you waiting for? You could save hundreds or even thousands of dollars on your next order. SD Bullion, the lowest prices, period.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah Johnson with SilverDoctors.com, and with us today is Mike Rivero from WhatReallyHappened.com. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me again.
All right. Well, I'd first like to discuss the emergency spending bill that was recently approved by Congress. Now, you've talked about how this emergency spending bill pretty much shows that the election made no difference. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, we're and not just in the emergency spending bill. We've now had two lessons where we elect presidents who promise change, getting out of the war agenda. Obama certainly was campaigning on he was going to end the wars. The first thing he did when he got into the White House, he never did. Same thing with Donald Trump. So I think Americans can come away from these experiences understanding that the elections really are a theater exercise to convince us that we still have some voice in the running of this country, but we don't. In fact, Paul Craig Roberts has an article out today saying that American democracy is a dead man walking because it doesn't matter who we all vote for. The oligarchs are basically calling the shots for the office holders who are merely front men for their agendas of greed and conquest and war. But as far as the emergency spending bill, what people seem to forget, the very reason they had to have an emergency spending bill is the government still cannot live within its means. It is spending and spending and spending mostly on these wars of conquest that we're all mired in. And as far as the spending bill itself, it was being politicized. They almost voided the bill itself over the argument over a border wall. And a lot of people are very upset that Planned Parenthood got funding in the emergency spending bill, but Trump's immigration department basically did not. They did not get the funds for the wall. So in a lot of ways, even though we have a Republican president and GOP control of both houses of Congress, the emergency spending bill is almost basically a liberal wet dream. And a lot of people are very upset about that. And the general American public is beginning to realize just how disenfranchised they have become in the current system.
You recently said on your radio show that really this shows that our nation is not controlled by, the people, but is really still just controlled by money and people with money.
Yeah, that very much is the case. And again, when our nation was first set up, it was organized in a way to basically bias the power towards the individual people, the individual communities, the individual states, and not have a central government that would just run roughshod over all of our rights. But over time, and especially following the Civil War, we have seen the rise of a central power, and that power, of course, is wide open to corruption. We used to have laws that limited how much money businesses could give to candidates in order to keep the candidates focused on the voter. Those laws are now gone. In last year's campaign, Hillary's efforts to fundraise among the grassroots were more for show than anything else. She got the vast majority of her money from Wall Street bankers and large corporations, and it basically it's the rise of a corporatocracy. And yeah, the big money always gets its way. That's why we're getting these, vaccines we don't really need. We're now being ordered that we must buy and use, not just for children, but now for adults, because it's just a big profit center. And they're going. We're in a phase where the government is going to order us to buy more and more things we don't really want or need to try and keep this economy going a little bit further, even though there are clear warning signs of a major collapse at some point in the near future.
You've also talked about how it seems like when there's financial problems, these financial problems also often lead to war, and that right now we're seeing a replay of the lead up to World War II.
Yes, we are. And there are two factors that contribute to this. The first is private central banking itself, which by design produces more debt than money with which to pay the debt. And it is actually the start of a three-step process, because once the private central bank is authorized to create the public currency and loan it into circulation, then the public is encouraged to borrow and go into debt till the public reaches a point where they refuse to borrow anymore because they're struggling under the existing debt. And they don't want to go any further. At that point, you have the Keynesian economists who come on in and say, well, government must start borrowing on behalf of the people, and notably without their permission, in order to keep the system going still further. Then you reach a point where the public won't borrow anymore and the government can't borrow anymore, and that is when the bankers will agitate to cause a major war, because in a war, the government and the people are forced to borrow more and plunge themselves further into the debt slavery of the banks. It is a three-step process, and when it's all over, basically ordinary people have what we had before, except the graveyards are a lot bigger, and we're back in debt slavery to the banks for another 100 years. Now, the other factor to take into account is that every time the federal government and the bankers have really wrecked the economy by biasing it toward themselves, and everybody understand that's what's going on. They love to get into a world war in order to distract the public from what they have done and say, oh, well, all the poverty and hardship, it's all because of the war. And you've got to rally around the government and the bankers during a war because otherwise we're going to lose. And it did work the last two times. Crash of 1907, get into World War I to get out of it. Crash of 1929, get into World War II to get out of that. Crash of 2008, and look how many countries the United States has invaded, regime changed, drone struck, and how many more are still on that list to be brought into the American empire. So we're basically in the opening stages of World War III right now. And my serious concern is that the United States ultimately is going to lose this one because it is militarily exhausted from all the ongoing wars it's struggling with. In fact, there was even a comment that Donald Trump can't drop any more bombs because the United States has run out. Of course, I'm sure they're already placing new orders with the arms manufacturers. But our current equipment is used up. It's worn out. The new weapons being built by the military-industrial complex are turning out to be highly overpriced pieces of junk. The F-35 is a good example, the Gerald R. Ford. And obviously, when you have other countries that are building weapons in a more cost-effective paradigm, that gives them an advantage because ultimately, while greed causes all wars, wars are decided by primarily which country runs out of money first and is no longer able to replace weapons lost in combat or repair those damaged in combat. And that is really a major factor in determining who's going to win this war. And the United States has lost much of its manufacturing. It offshores a lot of its manufacturing, even for weapons, and that could be embargoed and dried up in the event of a global conflict. So my concern, and it's shared by a lot of other people, is if the U.S. really does get us into a hot war with Russia and or China, there's going to come a day when they realize they cannot win it with conventional weapons, and at that point, they're not going to be able to resist the temptation to launch nuclear attacks. In fact, Paul Craig Roberts is saying his contacts within Washington, D.C. say they're already planning on how to do a nuclear first strike against Russia and China and not allow a retaliation with all these THAAD missiles that have been set up in South Korea and over in Europe. And simply to scare these other countries from attempting a retaliation. That's a very dangerous gamble to make when you're talking about the possible incineration of the surface of the earth.
What is your perspective on how Trump has seemingly flip-flopped on a lot of his positions with respect to, intervention in foreign affairs?
Well, I'm getting a lot of emails. People are saying maybe they showed him the Zapruder film of Kennedy and said, look, if you don't do what we tell you, we can kill you and get away with it. or maybe they're threatening his family. At this point, it doesn't really matter anymore how Donald Trump was convinced to reverse his policies on these various issues. All that matters is that he did. And it is a tremendous, very bitter disappointment to those who supported him, as I certainly did. Not so much that I was supporting Donald Trump last year. It's just I didn't want Hillary Clinton in the White House because things would have been even worse than they are right now. But to say that Trump has left his supporters disillusioned and disappointed, it may very well be that when he sent those cruise missiles into Syria, what he really bombed was all of his chances for a second term in office.
Now, you were talking about how the U.S. is really, the tensions between the U.S., Russia, and China are really growing right now. And you've talked about how the U.S. really likes to, before real war, play economic war with other countries. And they could be doing that right now with China.
They very well could. We know that the U.S. is engaged in economic war against many other countries, such as Venezuela, which is now on the verge of collapse. But what made China especially vulnerable to U.S. economic warfare was that back before 2008, when the economy was still ticking along, China's manufacturing economy was very heavily dependent on U.S. customers. China, rather than diversifying their sales across the globe, became too heavily dependent on U.S. consumers just snapping up those manufactured goods at the big box stores. Then, following 2008, as the consumer economy collapsed, Chinese exports fell, and that created a domino effect across their economy where they're in trouble right now. And we're already starting to see economic war symptoms, such as China's refusal of any grain or corn shipments from the United States that test positive for GMO, because China will not allow those in their country. But it is a ratcheting up of tensions. And very obviously, if in fact Donald Trump has been brought in to support the New World Order globalists, then sooner or later they're going to have to go up against Russia and China, because Russia and China have made it very, very clear they have no intention of surrendering their sovereignty and independence to a global government. And that bodes ill for the people of planet Earth.
Now, if what you're saying is true, that it seems like we're headed towards another world war. I mean, when we've talked about before on this show about, financial issues around the world and how people can prepare, there's pretty obvious ways that people can prepare for, a financial collapse. They can, keep their assets in things that don't fall to zero in hard times, such as precious metals. But in the case of a world war, how do people prepare for that kind of a thing?
Well, probably if you're talking about a nuclear world war, it's move away from where the bombs are likely to fall. And Claire and I are trying to put together the money to get off this island, because right now our home overlooks Pearl Harbor, which is guaranteed to be hit in a war with Russia and China, because all the communications for the entire Pacific Fleet route through this island. And so it's making us very, very nervous. There have been a lot of articles in the local newspapers about how little time we'll have if North Korea decides to attack Hawaii, how little time we would have to find shelters. And there are no public bomb shelters, war shelters here in Hawaii. All the shelters are for the military and government people only, built at taxpayer expense, but of course the taxpayers, there's no room for them inside. So it's a nasty situation, and realizing that the U.S. entry into World War II began with Hawaii, Hawaii could once again be used as the bloody shirt to get us into World War III for real. So it's very disconcerting for a lot of people. As far as preparing for the war, you prepare for it like any other disaster. You have storable food, you have drinkable water or a good water filtration system. Certainly converting as much of your assets into tangible assets you can hang on to, like precious metals, makes a lot of sense, which is why it's very alarming that we see these proponents of the cash-free system talk about ban on private ownership of precious metal at the same time. And remember, the United States actually did that before in 1933, when Roosevelt ordered the American people to turn in their non-jewelry gold in exchange for stacks of ink and paper, which promptly became worthless. And so they could conceivably do it again. And so if you are buying silver and gold for wealth preservation, you need to do it in very small lots below the level at which you're going to be tracked. And unfortunately, they keep moving that number around, so I don't know what the current level is.
You mentioned the war on cash. Did you want to give us an update on the move away from, tangible assets and tangible, not just tangible assets, but also just tangible cash, and towards this, trackable online or, digital system of currency?
Well, basically, in its simplest form, a cash-free society says that all of the wealth of the nation is inside the bank's computers, and you have a little plastic card where whenever you work, whatever you earn goes directly to the bank, and then you use a little card to get the money that you need to buy food and pay your rent and so forth and so on. And it is being done to basically make all of that wealth available to the banks to try and play their little games to stay solvent, even though in the long run that is an impossibility under private central banking. And I would like to remind everybody else that the United States did experiment with a system in which the workers were not allowed control of the wealth their labor generated. It was kept for them and managed for them. And they, in return, were fed and housed, and that was called the antebellum slavery plantation. And so in a very real way, this push for a cash-free society is a return to that kind of servitude, or if you want to call it a neo-feudalism or a serfdom, as well as that if you are not allowed to use cash for anything, all of your purchases can be tracked and analyzed by the government. And I'm a very private person. And if I decide to stop off on my way home from work and get a jelly donut at the donut shop, that's really not the government's business. And I do resent them keeping an eye on my jelly donut fixations because it is none of their business under that Fourth Amendment.
Now, what are some ways that people can speak out about this? Because I know on your website, you've been speaking out about our liberty. And basically, one of the things you talk about how your website has actually, how our freedom of speech is actually under attack right now. On your website, it says, announcement, still getting hacked. If you cannot see the page, wait a few minutes and try again. So what are some ways, if you wanted to just give your own personal testimony, how your freedom of speech has been under attack?
Well, freedom of speech is under attack in a lot of different ways. Yes, my server is under constant hack attack, and I've had to write a lot of custom software to just keep it running despite the attacks. And but we're seeing corporate media and various interest groups are trying to go after our advertisers, and not just ours. I mean, just all across the independent media as a whole, getting advertisers to pull their advertising to try and starve us of wealth. Well, we can't even call it wealth. We're all just barely getting by, which is why it's an effective tool. And they're trying to basically economically starve us out of existence. Now we're having these large corporate social media platforms like Facebook and Google and YouTube are now openly exercising censorship by putting the status quo, government-approved stuff at the very top of their pages and making it intentionally much more difficult to find independent media websites. And so they're basically ducking the issue of the First Amendment by saying, we're not stopping you from saying what you want to say, but we're just making it easier for our customers to avoid the fake news that's out there. And that is a big propaganda campaign they're trying to use, even to the point where there have been recently several websites set up that do nothing but post garbage stories to the internet, so the corporate media can say, well, look what you're finding over there in the independent media, all these completely bogus, discredited stories. You should come on back and trust the corporate media. It isn't working so far, but it shows you just how afraid of the independent media and free speech our current oligarchy has become. And we're seeing all this open discussions about how there have to be limits to the First Amendment, that freedom of the press should only apply to those who've got the money to afford a real press. There have been arguments that the independent media shouldn't be covered by the First Amendment. Head of the CIA is out there saying WikiLeaks should not be protected by the First Amendment, but that Bill of Rights is an absolute. And anytime they go on in and say, well, this should not be applied to people we don't like, that basically is turning the country into a dictatorship.
Now, what are some ways that, people, you are already speaking out against this, but what are some ways that, the average person can also speak out against this?
Well, speaking out right now is very easy to do. It's a very good thing to do. In fact, right now it is desperately needed, and you don't need to go to the trouble of setting up a website. All you need to do is, when you are concerned about what you're seeing, the escalation of war in Syria, the escalation of war in North Korea, you can just get out on your social media and just say, hey, this is wrong. You can get on your email list and just send out emails of your own commentary. We are all part of the independent media now, and we need to start acting like it. Every single person who is not on the side with this war agenda. In fact, one of the stories we posted to What Really Happened early this morning is apparently Americans are actually posting messages to Russia on this one website that is seen in Russia, saying, we, the people of the United States of America, wish you and the Russian people well. We are not on board with this war agenda by our government. And that is perhaps the most important single message we can send to the rest of the world right now, that we, the American people, do not agree with or support the militarism of our current oligarchy. And we don't have a democracy anymore. We don't have a republic anymore. Clearly, we have a very cleverly crafted dictatorship that tries to maintain the illusion that we still have a choice. But again, Trump's reversal on his economic and military policy shows, no, the election didn't change the course this nation is on. The course the nation is on is being dictated by our 60 richest families working together. And if everybody wants to have a label for it called the deep state, that's basically it. The wealthy oligarchs are running and ruining this country, the same as they were in the former Soviet Union.
All right. Well, Mike Rivero, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had and where they can find you online?
Well, my website, of course, is whatreallyhappened.com. I also do a talk radio show on the Republic Broadcasting Network from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Central U.S. time, Monday through Friday. And right now, it is very important that you do go on out and you share your concerns with your coworkers, your friends, your fellow students, your members of your family. And yes, you're going to get a little bit of pushback from those who are in denial or who may be undercover informants for various government agencies. But staying silent right now is absolutely the worst thing that anybody can do, because we need to let the rest of the American public out there who are just as concerned with the direction of the nation know they are not alone. We all need to speak out, type out, post out, social media. We need to just make a huge noise to send that message that the military policy of the United States is being decided by a few individuals and is not supported by the bulk of the American people.
All right. Well, Mike Rivero, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.